Hello again, everyone. So today I want to take a look at the Norton Utilities for DOS and Windows 3.1. I bought this program a long time ago. I can't get it in frame there. And it was one of my favorite utilities that I had ever come across, at least during that era. It was introduced to me by my brother, who was who was in IT. I wasn't at the time. I was still going through school. There's the instruction manual. Because, I'm sure you guys have all seen an instruction manual before. And then, of course, we have the original discs. Comes on 1, 2, 3, 4 floppy disks, and you typically had to supply your own for the emergency disk, the emergency boot disk that you can create. I really enjoyed the set of utilities because it had a lot of features that were typically missing from DOS. One of the things that made Norton so famous to begin with was those utilities. For me, it wasn't so much the undelete utility. I know that was the one that kicked off the franchise of Norton, because DOS originally had no way to recover deleted files, and it was basically a lifesaver utility. For me, it was the fact that I started on DOS 6.0 when I bought my first computer, and it didn't have a proper disk utility like this right here that you see popping up. This is part of Norton Utilities 8.0. This is the Norton Disk Doctor doing a quick check at startup. So let's take a look at some of the utilities that we have here. So many of you might be familiar with these utilities. You have, of course, the batch enhancer. That came in really handy if you wanted to create some really fancy batch files. I used it for a while, but I ended up finding other utilities that seemed to do a little bit better and didn't require me to include some of the other Norton Utilities files. But the batch enhancer is a great little utility that can do a lot of different things. You also have calibrate that can help you calibrate your disk. This is mainly for RLL and MFM drives that can calibrate the interleave. This is generally not needed on anything newer. They included it, I don't know, maybe just to inflate the number of utilities that they had, maybe. Or maybe they felt it might still be helpful for people who were still using older systems. Then, of course, there's the incredibly powerful tool Disk Edit. You could actually edit the fat entries on a disk. You could edit the hex entries directly on the disk if you wanted to with that utility. For that reason, because it's incredibly powerful, it normally starts up in read-only mode, and you have to actually specify that you want to enable write mode by doing a /W, or when you're in the utility, you can actually turn it on. Now, I've always enjoyed the neat little DOS interface that the Norton Utilities always had. But here's a standard directory listing. You can switch to view, and you can see the everything is hex. Here are the hexadecimal values. Here are the ASCII representations. Zeros are blank spaces or represented by dots. And as you can see, here's some of the file names in there, nedw.help, and it leaves these blank spaces because a file name can have up to 8 characters. So, it very powerful, very dangerous if you don't know what you're doing, to be perfectly honest. And this is where Norton has always really excelled, is in their DOS utilities. You have DiskMon that could flash a little icon in the corner every time something's being written to disk, in case you were extra paranoid and wanted to see if something was writing to your disk while you had an application running. I think you can even block writes and do it like a read-only. Enable, yeah, you can do disk protect and disk light. The disk light would actually put a little icon down in the corner. It even comes with a disk park for those older hard drives that still needed to have their heads parked. Again, that was primarily RLL and MFM drives. Discrete is a disk encryption program. It worked much the same as like disk compression. What it would do is it would create a file on your hard drive, and it would be password protected. You can... Yeah, I don't have the discrete driver loaded, so it's going to complain. But you could actually create and encrypt a file, and I don't remember what encryption method it has, and since I don't have the driver loaded, I can't provide an example. I suppose if I try, it's going to complain. Yeah, it's trying to access drive D, which is my CD-ROM drive. And it's going to browse a file to encrypt. So basically what happens is you got to load a device driver that can access the encrypted file that's much like a compressed file. But instead, well, I mean, I suppose it could include encryption. I don't think Norton included it, though. And it would mount the encrypted file as a separate drive letter, as if it was a RAM disk or a compressed disk. And only those who had the right password could actually mount the drive. So this gave a level of security that you could put files inside and make sure nobody else can access, even if they have access to your system. This, of course, being during the time when, computers were single user, no security in mind. You just turn on the system and it boots up. There was nothing that prevents you from accessing the rest of the system. There was no concept as like administrator and user level for DOS. That wouldn't come until much later in Windows NT. So discrete is pretty interesting. I did play around with it back in the day, and then of course there's Disk Tool. That's actually a bunch of utilities thrown together. These all used to be separate utilities in older versions of Norton Utilities. You can sys a disk. You can use it instead of DOS's sys command. Kind of makes it pointless since the sys command already exists, but if you wanted to use Norton exclusively, or if you wanted to put it on a floppy drive and have all these utilities and save a little space, this allows you to recover disks. Not all disks were recoverable, so it was questionable on if it would work. I tried using it way back in the day to recover some floppy disks that were developing errors. They must have been physical errors because they were never able to actually fix it. You can revive a defective diskette. I think actually this was one of the options I tried, or maybe I tried both. But it didn't make a difference. The disk had bad spots and was only getting worse. And this is where you can manually mark a cluster as bad. If you know that a particular cluster is bad and you don't want to reformat it, you can actually mark it yourself. I believe you can do this on a floppy and a hard drive, so your choice. You have directory sort. That's comes from older utilities. I won't go over that too much. Dupe disk, that's a like disk copy, but it has a really nice interface. That's one of the other things that was really nice about the Norton Utilities, is that it always had like a nice little graphical interface as opposed to all the text output. And they had this amazing ability to do these thin lines and put it right over the existing DOS window. I always thought that was really cool. And then, of course, you have the amazing drop shadows as well. So you can actually duplicate a diskette, or you can use disk copy, so that makes that tool questionable at times. FA is file attribute. You could just use the attrib command. But back in early versions of DOS, like I think DOS 3.3 did not come with an attributes command or a attrib command. So that was handy during that time era. fcompare allows you to compare files. fd, what is fd again? Oh, file date. You can set the date and time on files. That came in handy if you wanted to distribute files and you wanted to make sure that they were of a specific time and date for whatever reason. I actually use that all the time for my own little utilities that I used to release, which were compiled batch files. I used to enjoy. Anyways, I always used file date for distributing my compiled batch files back in the day, and I always wanted the date and time to be to a specific date in a specific time. File find allows you to find files on your hard disk. File fix would fix specific files. Again, some of these utilities were from like Norton Utilities 7, so most people won't see much of a difference, and this isn't where Norton Utilities 8 shines. I'm just going quickly through some of the DOS utilities. But File Fix allowed you to fix Lotus 123, Symfony, Quattro Pro, WordPerfect, and other DBase files. So, you know, you could fix some files that might have been broken of those specific types. You had FL, or File Locate, File what's FS? File size. That would tell you the size of a file. You know, I'm not sure the usefulness of that, since you get that in the directory listing. Although I think this would actually show you the slack space. Yeah, my config sys is 1071 bytes, but each allocation unit is 32K for a total occupied space of 96% slack. So that means that each file has to contain a minimum of one allocation unit. Each file, no matter how little it takes up, even if it were 1 byte, would take up 32,768 bytes for one allocation unit. And since my config sys file uses up 1071 bytes of the allocation unit, leaves 96% of the allocation unit open as slack space, unusable. You can't, other files can't use that space. So that was always interesting. You can see exactly how wasteful FAT file system was, especially as hard disk partitions grew larger and larger. Then you have the image utility, which was always good to run during startup. It would take a quick snapshot of your disk information and your boot sector information. You could also use this to back up that information onto a safe boot disk, which it would a rescue boot disk, which is what they would recommend that you do. INI Editor and INI Tracker and INI Tracker for DOS. Some of those utilities are specifically for Windows, but I think INI Track D is a DOS version of the INI Tracker. You can take snapshots of specific files, config sys, autoexec.bat, you could even do, the system.ini, win.ini. You have INI Tuner, which would help you tune up your INI files, your Windows INI files specifically. Line printer, Norton Cache 2. Norton Cache is very efficient file cache, especially at larger file sizes, but consumes an incredible amount of memory for TSR space. I'm going to continue going quickly through here since a lot of these utilities are redundant and I know people are very familiar with them from older versions. You do have the Norton Disk Doctor, which can scan your entire disk. There's Norton Disk Doctor for Windows, that's what I want to show today, particularly is the Windows utilities for all of this. You do have NDiags, which can help you diagnose certain system issues. It would go through and it would test, your system board. If you had loopback cables, you can test your serial port, your parallel port. You can do a base and extended memory test. Typically for the extended memory test, it will force you to reboot without any memory managers loaded so that it can test the raw memory without having to work through your memory manager. For some reason, a lot of utilities back in the day preferred to do this instead of working through the memory manager. I'm not sure what particular reason, but you can test your hard drive, you can do some limited video tests, you can test your keyboard lights, a speaker test, a mouse test. Unfortunately, these aren't automated, like with your mouse test and your keyboard test. You have to actually press it. But it at least lets you know whether a key that you're pressing actually works if you're curious of if it's a broken key or whatnot. Although that may not always be indicative of failing hardware. It could be something else going on with the system. So NDiags was very interesting. Came in handy a few times. You have the Norton Utilities configurator, NU config, that allows you to configure all the startup programs. You can also customize like the video and mouse, what you want everything to look like. You can change this to be like, EGA2, and that would change it to look like this. Some people prefer that look. Whereas EGA1, I believe, would revert those. There you go. You can configure your printer. You can set the location of temporary files, set passwords on certain programs, startup programs. You could use the NDOS command processor, which actually was a licensed copy of 4DOS, but it was an older version. The key stack memory resident utility, which I believe was a keyboard buffer utility. I think it was much like DOS key before DOS key was included in DOS. Not sure why it doesn't have my disk format data image running, because I swear I had it configured that way, unless I accidentally took it out. SmartCAN is your undelete. You can actually include a TSR to watch for deleted files, and it'll store them in a special location on your hard drive, and you could easily recover them if using this method. Now, of course, that became rather redundant once DOS 6 ended up including undelete from Central Point Tools, Central Point Software. But Norton had their own version, so if you're a big Norton fan, you can use this version versus the DOS version. Both used about the same amount of memory, 10 kilobytes. Again, with the advantage of Norton is that you always got this consistent and rather appealing looking textual interface. You can edit some of the menus. You can set up alternate names, like if you want disk editor to just be DE, or if you want save format to just be SF, or if you want to actually be format and rename your format command in your DOS directory, you can do that. Dupe disk, you can do just a DD or disk copy to obviously copy what DOS did. Speed disk can be either speed disk or SD. You can specify all short names for all the utilities. So it's very interesting how customizable it was as well. Then, of course, you have the rescue disk. This required that you have a blank 1.44 meg floppy disk. Might even require two, depending on how many files. You can actually include additional files in this listing. As you can see, it takes up 1.1 meg, so there's very little space, but you do have a little bit of space on a 1.4 meg floppy to add a few of your own files that you specify. But it would automatically come with all of this. It would copy fdisk from DOS. You can choose to include Norton diagnostics if you want to. It would include the discrete startup in case you wanted to load your discrete, your protected discrete encrypted drive. Everything with the check mark is customizable. You can remove it. This is my mouse driver. One moment. So you can actually include utilities that you have on your system. It would automatically scan it for certain utilities, like it automatically detected my Microsoft IntelliPoint mouse driver, and it recognizes that it's 104 kilobytes large. Anything with an asterisk is you can't exclude it. It's included on the rescue disk automatically and must be included. And you can hit the browse button to go ahead and include additional files from your system onto this rescue disk. And if it became too large, it would prompt you for a second rescue disk. And it would you could prompt it to format the diskette as it creates them, or if you want to just update change files, if you wanted to update one of your existing rescue disks, came built in automatically. Rescue disk was very nice, and glad it was included. SEW is speed disk for Windows. S format is the safe formatting utility. Safe format really wasn't needed anymore, especially in DOS 6's format. Previous versions of DOS format just formatted a diskette and was done with it, or a hard drive. But it was discovered that there was a way to copy FAT information into a specific portion, inaccessible portion of the floppy disk, so that you could easily recover it. That hence it was a safe format. You could format the disk, back up the FAT information, and if you decided, oh shoot, I actually needed that floppy diskette, you can then run the unformat utility in DOS, and you could recover it. And all it would do is put the FAT information back, and all your files would be there, because the format wouldn't actually wipe out everything. It would actually just go through and zero the first entry of every file on the FAT table, and merely restoring the FAT information and restoring some of the file content structure would allow you to bring the entire disk back. But it would only work if you had just formatted it. If you already wrote some files to it, there's a good chance you weren't going to be able to recover any of your older files. So once you start using that disk, the chances of recovery becomes rather slim. SmartCAN we already discussed. It's the undelete utility speed disk for DOS. You can defragment your hard drive or floppy drive if you really want to. Sysinfo, a lot of you are familiar with. It's included with Phil's Computer Lab DOS benchmark. It gives you information about your system. SysWatch is another Windows utility which I want to show. You have text search, unerase, unformat, and wipe info. Wipe info was interesting because it would actually wipe a file from your hard drive. So if you had a sensitive file that you wanted to make sure was absolutely gone from your machine, you use wipe info, and you could configure it to wipe the file using, I think, government. Yeah, wipe according to U.S. government rules. So basically repeat a pattern n times, repeat the pattern 3 times, or you can specify even more or whatever. So you can make sure that you were deleting that file and it was going to make it unrecoverable from any recovery program, not even using like disk edit to try to review the contents or the FAT space or whatever. It was gone once it was wiped. So that could come in handy if you were very security minded. So that's all the DOS utilities. I don't think there's many COM files. Yeah, the keyboard stacker and NDOS were the only COM files that were included. So let's go ahead and pop over to Windows and let's take a quick look at the Windows utilities. Give it a second as it starts up the network. There it is. Ta-da! Let's go ahead and log in. Not that we need to be logged in for this, but whatever. Now, what I liked about this version 8 of Norton Utilities was that it came with Windows 3.1 applications. So if you wanted to remain in Windows, within the Windows environment, or if you were a sysadmin who had actually blocked exiting the Windows environment, I know of a couple companies that used to do that. They did not want you going down to DOS. They would actually modify program manager so there was no exit to Windows here. You couldn't save options. There's all sorts of things you can do in the INI files and really lock it down. So if you wanted to stay within the GUI environment, you could launch some of the Norton utilities from here. Here's a lot of the same DOS utilities in its own DOS group. These are all DOS applications just using a PIF file or a program information file. That was the precursor to linked files or creating shortcuts in Windows 95. That's what you would do in Windows 3 and Windows 3.1. You'd use the PIF editor to create a PIF file, a program information file, and it would give the Windows the information it needed to run that DOS application. And then, of course, there is the Windows programs. These actually are Windows native. You could check a hard drive directly from within Windows. And this, again, was the precursor to being able to do all this in Windows 95 and 98. In fact, this version had to be patched to support Windows 3.11 and the 32-bit disk and 32-bit file access. 32-bit disk access was already included in Windows 3.1, but 32-bit file access was introduced with Windows 3.11. Now, interesting to note that if you had a DOS undelete TSR loaded and you are using the 32-bit file access driver, the 32-bit file access driver bypasses DOS entirely to keep the system performant. It accesses everything in 32-bit protected mode, bypasses the BIOS, bypasses DOS, and has its own API for directly handling hard disk routines. Your DOS-based TSR will not be able to see files deleted under Windows because of this. So that kind of made the undelete utilities become rather pointless if you were running in Windows 3.11. And that's why I think Microsoft ended up including the recycle bin with Windows 95 so that you can still recover from within a GUI environment. And it did this pretty much the same. It would create a special folder on the hard drive called recycle.bin, I think. They have added various names throughout history, throughout various versions of Windows. And it was essentially just like the DOS version. It would create a special hidden folder and copy all files into that hidden folder and have a log of all the names of the files that were being deleted that you could easily undelete. Same concept, but all worked within the 32-bit protected mode environment without having to access DOS or the BIOS. So it saved a lot of context switching and was a lot faster. You do have speed disk. This allows you to defragment your drive directly from within Windows. I like the graphical interface here in how many different colors are used for representing the different blocks that are up there. And you can turn on verifying if you want to verify the information. You could do that in the DOS version too. You can turn on verify, something that the DOS defrag utility I don't believe did. It didn't do any verifying, or maybe it was turned on by default, but they never actually mentioned it. This disk is largely unfragmented, so no point in defragmenting it. But it's really nice. You could even individually click on clusters. I think you can do this in the DOS version too. And it would tell you what files were in that cluster, what cluster number, etc. So if you had a bad spot on the hard drive and you clicked on it, you can literally see what cluster number that was. And see, like this one is largely marked as unmovable. It already has various files in here that are already optimized and defragmented, but it has this one unmovable block, and so the whole thing gets listed as unmovable. It's only for graphical display purposes. The files can still be moved around. It doesn't mean everything in that block can't be moved. It's literally just the one that's listed as unmovable. So it was a pretty good directory display if you wanted to take a look at cluster numbers and what was in that cluster. This is the system watch. You might have seen this on other videos of mine. I kind of like it because it gives you a resource display, and I like this one better than the one from Nuts and Bolts. I did a video on that. If you haven't seen it, you should go check it out. But it gives you an idea of, total Windows memory, which is typically a combination of physical and swap space or virtual memory. You can turn on and off all these different resource information, DOS memory, GDI resources, user resources. You can even have a CPU utilization, and it would give you an idea how much CPU is being used. But the cache hits, again, that was only for DOS disk caches and was largely useless if you were using 32-bit file access, because the 32-bit file access has its own Windows cache. Again, it was all designed to keep you in the 32-bit protected mode environment. It was a 32-bit cache driver. In fact, let's go and take a very quick look at what I'm talking about. Some of you may have seen this, some of you maybe haven't. If you aren't using it and you want better performance, I would definitely recommend that you turn it on. See here, I am using 32-bit disk access and 32-bit file access for the C drive. If I had other drives, it would show them. 32-bit file access does not work on CD-ROM drives in this version. But once you turn on 32-bit file access, you can actually set up your own disk cache. This cache is not optimized for anything larger than 4 megs. You can go larger than 4 megs. In my experience, going larger than 4 megs can cause problems for some programs to load, particularly drivers. It did not like working with large disk cache sizes. So I would recommend no more than 8 meg, but sticking right around the 4 meg area is ideal. And it speeds up performance quite a bit without having to do all the context switching and accessing the disk through DOS. So that kind of shows what you can do with the system watch. There's even a histogram. You can take a look at some of the stuff. You can customize a lot of the sensors. Like if I wanted to customize the sensor options here for Windows memory, I can turn on an alarm. It can be an audible alarm. I can flash. I can tell it to do nothing. I can change the display to a percentage. Windows memory 83% free. So it's super customizable and really cool to be able to have that quick look. And you can do this for all of the resource displays on your system. So I've always really liked having SysWatch running. It does take up a little bit of memory and a little bit of performance, but generally I don't notice it taking up too much performance. It's generally okay. So then we have the file compare. This is just a graphical way of letting you compare INI files, text files, batch files. You can technically try to load up any other file, but if it's not ASCII text, it won't be able to compare the files so well. It wasn't intended for that. But you can totally compare, if you have a copy of config.sys and config.back. Like, yeah, we'll do config.sys in one on the left, and then we will do config.back on the right, and we can see what changes were made between the two files. So that could be kind of cool to be able to view that side by side from within Windows. And of course you can change all sorts of options in here. You can change, I think you can change the font. Options, customize. No, but you can show like what's different in red and what's been moved if you've been editing the file in blue. So that this can come in very handy. The INI tracker is essentially like the image command from DOS, but instead of taking snapshots of your boot sector and etc., this one would take snapshots of all your important INI files, including autoexec.bat and configsys. But you can also add in like system.ini, win.ini, and any other INIs, and it would track all the changes for you. It would keep backups of them. You could go back to older versions. So if you were doing a lot of editing with an INI file, you can always go back if you needed to. INI Tuner came in really handy because it is pretty much a full, complete documentation of every single item in system and win.ini. And it would tell you, what section it belongs in. Here we go, 32-bit disk access. Its current value is that it's on. It exists in the 3D6 enhanced section of your system.ini file. It's default to off, so you have to always turn it on yourself. And this is the syntax. You go into your 3D6 enhanced section and you do 32-bit disk access equals off or on. And it had that pretty much for every single setting that was possible. This was incredibly helpful for finding those weird settings that you weren't sure of what it did. If you had a setting in your system.ini or win.ini, you can look it up and it would tell you. And it would even scan your existing one. Like, here's my keyboard driver, which is part of my IntelliPoint driver set. It would tell you that I'm currently loading it from msinput.386. And where it was, and the default was the virtual keyboard driver. The asterisk means that it's built into Windows. So if you ever see a system.ini entry with an asterisk in front of it, it means use the built-in function that's built into the kernel. I'm actually overriding it and using the MSInput driver. Well, Microsoft chose to do that for me, and I just let it. And it would give you some advice if you wanted to find out what keyboard equals file name is. And the entire database is searchable, 386 enhanced section. I mean, this is just absolutely full of information. 32-bit disk access. What is fast disk? How does fast disk work? Use 32-bit disk access. And it would give you information. So I would spend hours reading this and learning about how my system worked under Windows. This was invaluable to me. And then, of course, it has its own INI editor because Microsoft would hide sysedit, which came with Windows. I guess they didn't want noobs going through and easily editing INI files, even though everybody would edit it with Notepad. But you actually have sysedit built into Windows. Most techies know about this. Not everybody does. Just type sysedit, and it'll load up all of your configuration files for your system. I have scheduler installed. I have a mail protocol installed. I have networking, system, win, configsys, autoexec.bat. You can edit everything right from here instead of dropping down to DOS to edit all your configuration files. So if you're frustrated with the PC-DOS E editor, you can do it in Windows. Though a lot of people didn't want to start up Windows just to load an editor and then drop back down to reboot. But, you work with what you have. And then, of course, the INI Advisor would go through and give you more information in a different format, using disk caching, 32-bit disk access, smart drive, Norton cache, using a disk cache. This is specifically talking about DOS disk caches. This was released before Windows 3.11, so it doesn't have too much information on using the Windows file access cache. But it does tell you, which one is better to use. You want to use the Norton cache, you want to use DOS's smart drive, you could. This small set of utilities I found incredibly invaluable for running on a Windows 3.1 system, and some of them even carried over into their Windows 95 counterparts when they released the Norton Utilities for Windows 95. So it's a very interesting set of utilities. This is one of the reasons why I really like loading up Norton Utilities 8 on any system that is capable of it. Although for funsies, I like to load up, Helix Software's nuts and bolts or other utility software. I also have a copy of First Aid 95, which did work with Windows 3.1 because it was right in that intermediate period. I'll probably do a video on that a little bit in the future since I'm on a little kick here of doing utilities. But that's a look at Norton Utilities for DOS and Windows 3.1. Very interesting suite of utilities. The inclusion of Windows utilities was incredibly helpful. If you're still using an older version of Norton Utilities, version 6, version 7, and I don't need anything newer, this might be a good reason to use the Windows version of these utilities if you want to stay within the Windows environment, if you do a lot of work within the Windows environment, which I know a lot of retro people, they do everything directly from DOS. DOS definitely has more power. It's fun to type at the command line. DOS is far more flexible. You don't have to deal with the quirks and intricacies and idiosyncrasies of Windows. But once again, if you really enjoy using a graphical environment and try to stay within a graphical environment and don't want to upgrade to Windows 95, maybe the system isn't powerful enough to run Windows 95, Norton Utilities is definitely a good add-on to your collection. So that brings this video to an end. I thank you for coming along and hope to see you in the next one.